So last month I featured podcast host Heather Pantoja as my guest host. Heather provided you with a list of her favorite books written by women authors. This month I've asked former author awareness interviewee Matthew Romeo to return and provide his top 10 reading recommendations. I hope you enjoy Matt's suggestions.
Hey Garrett. So here is my top 10 book recommendations in descending order. Number 10, I'd have to go with Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I recently read this book. It is a staple in the science fiction genre, but it's more of a collection of short novellas rather than a full story, at least in my opinion. So that kind of makes it a little weak on my end, but I know that a lot of the themes and storytelling in this book makes it very classic. It does have a lot of great world building. For 9, I'd have to go with Eragon by Christopher Paolini. It is one of my formative novels. I read it when I was 14. It is a fantastic entry into the fantasy genre, if that's what you're into. It's got a lot of classic motifs, and it might feel a little familiar to a lot of readers, but I think that it is a great start to, kind of just a innocent and complex fantasy world in the world of Allegatia with Eragon. At number 8, I'm going to have Dune by Frank Herbert. This is another science fiction classic. I read it a couple years ago before the movie came out. And it's a very interesting and complex science fiction world. It does have a very interesting POV, which is, I believe, omniscient, which can kind of turn some readers off, but I found it very fascinating, at least for the time period that it was written in. And it is just so rich in detail and themes that it's a classic science fiction book. At number 7, I'm going to have Stormfront by Jim Butcher. It is one of the first in the Dresden Files. This is more of a contemporary fantasy series. It's written in first person, so you get a lot of classic witty banter from the main character, Harry Dresden. And it's really cool to see a modern take on the detective files, but it's in a fantasy genre. And Harry Dresden himself is just such a fun and rich character to dive into. Number 6, I'm going to have The Martian by Andy Weir. This is such a fun book to get into because of the main character's just commentary on his situation being stranded on Mars. It's a fun survival book. It gets really lighthearted, but it also has a lot of deep character moments. And it's just a very fascinating premise of taking, that stranded man on an island, but putting it in space on Mars. For number 5, I'm going to go with The Way of Shadows by Brent Weeks. This is another great fantasy series. It's very gritty. It's kind of the tale of a magic assassin who's raised from poverty. It's a very interesting inverse on the hero's journey. Instead of him becoming, the classic hero, it's him becoming the world's deadliest assassin. It's a very rich world, a lot of great character development, and it's got one of my favorite love stories, and that's kind of me being a bit of a sap for that. Number 4, I'm going to have Mistborn, The Final Empire, first in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. This is a staple of the fantasy genre right now. Brandon Sanderson is fantastic at world building. From the first line in Mistborn, it hooks you in, and it has one of the best main character duos in all of his books, which is Vin and Kelsier. It's a mentor-mentee relationship, and you really get a bit of a heist story in this book as well. At number 3, I'm going to have Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is a fantastic science fiction novel written in first person. You get a lot of gritty action. It's a fantastic revolution story. It's what got me wanting to write my own stories in science fiction. And just Pierce Brown is so great at making complex, relatable characters that he drags them through the mud, but for good reason. Number 2, I'm going to have Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. This is a fantastic fantasy book. It's very evocative of a classic rock band going back on tour for one last go, but instead of a rock band, it's a adventuring band, very reminiscent of Dungeons and Dragons. You have classic character archetypes, and you have a wonderful main character in Clay Cooper, he's just such a cynic and so gruff, but he has great banter, and he has a lot of heart as well. And number 1, I'm going to have The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This is an incredible fantasy book. It made me want to be a better writer. It made me want to be a better man because there are just so many great characters in this story that go through so much, particularly with Kaladin, one of the main characters, and his story of going through the traumas of war, the the difficulty of slavery, and eventually freeing himself, and just becoming what he's meant to be. The magic system is fantastic. The world building is incredible. The world of Roshar is just so rich and so detailed that I could get lost in it for hours. The Way of Kings, I've probably listened to the graphic audio of this book, I'd say at least 20 times. It's my comfort book, and if you're wanting to delve into a very rich world, this is the book for you.
A big thank you goes out to Matthew for being this month's guest host. Now, if you're interested in picking up one of the books mentioned in his segment, you can find that list of titles and their ISBN numbers down in the video description. You can also find links to connect with Matt's author accounts on social media.